The leaky cauldron smelled of smoke, and something warm Harry couldn't name, and everyone inside it knew who he was. He hadn't understood that at first. The old barman with his toothless smile, the witch in the violet cloak, the short man who'd nearly dropped his pint. They'd all done it, one after another. The look that started at his face and then dropped, just slightly, to his forehead, as if checking that the thing they remembered was still there. It was. Harry was beginning to understand that the scar was not quite a part of him, so much as the part of him that other people had decided to see first. "Come on, Harry," Hagrid said, and his great hand settled on Harry's shoulder and steered him forward before anyone could do more than stare. Hagrid was 11.5 feet of human wall. The crowd parted because there was nothing else it could do. Outside and through the brick archway, 3 taps of Hagrid's pink umbrella, the right ones, and the wall folded itself away. Diagon Alley was too much to take in at once. Colour and noise and the smell of owl feathers, robes of every shade from midnight to saffron, a cart piled with self-stirring cauldrons. Hagrid waited with the patience of a man who had done this before. Then he pointed at the white building at the end of the street and said, "Gringotts," and they walked toward it. He added in a lower voice that no one had ever broken into it, then checked briefly over his enormous shoulder and walked a little faster. The marble stairs were broad enough for 10 men. The goblin by the door was smaller than Harry and carried itself like it wasn't. Inside, another door, and then a hall far larger than its outside had any right to suggest. Marble floors, polished mirror smooth. Dozens of goblins at a long counter, each bent over ledgers or weighing coins or simply watching the humans below with the steady attention of creatures for whom patience was a professional requirement. Harry stopped beside a sign above the vault doors and read it. "Enter, stranger, but take heed of what awaits the sin of greed. For those who take, but do not earn, must pay most dearly in their turn. So if you seek beneath our floors a treasure that was never yours, thief, you have been warned. Beware of finding more than treasure there." A goblin named Griphook was assigned to them. He said his name the way people do when they expect it to be forgotten, which was probably accurate. He led them through a back door and into a mine cart, and the floor fell away. Down. Faster. The temperature dropped. The light changed from gold to something cooler and mineral. The cart rattled past vault doors of increasing weight and complexity, each one a degree more serious than the last, as though the bank's confidence in its own security decreased the further underground you went. The air smelled of cold stone and old metal. Harry held on. Vault 713 was at the end of a passage so deep that the cold had a specific quality, not outside cold, but the cold of a place that had never been warm, had never wanted to be. The door was plain and massive, and somehow the plainness made it worse. Griphook pressed his palm to it. It swung open without ceremony. Hagrid reached in and retrieved something small, wrapped in brown paper, tucked it into the inner pocket of his great coat without a word. And they left. Harry didn't ask. They rose. Less steeply. Harry unclenched his hands from the cart's sides. Vault 687 sat at a moderate depth, not as far down as some, nothing like as deep as where they'd just been. Griphook worked a sequence of touch points along the door's surface. The vault opened and green smoke poured out of it. Slow, rolling over the lip of the threshold and spreading across the corridor floor before thinning into nothing. It had no smell Harry could name, and it vanished before he could feel it. Nobody commented. Apparently this was something vaults did. Inside, money, mounds of dull gold coins, and smaller silver ones, and small bronze ones heaped in the back. Harry stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. Galleons, Hagrid said, appearing at his shoulder. "The gold ones. Then sickles, 17 to a galleon. And the little bronze ones are nuts, 29 to a sickle." He counted out a good quantity of each into the pouch he'd brought and held it out. Harry took the pouch. He'd worn Dudley's old trainers for 2 years, because Vernon said he didn't need new ones, and Petunia agreed. He'd eaten what was left after Dudley was full, and slept in a cupboard under the stairs because the other rooms had better uses. He stood in the doorway of a vault full of gold that had been sitting here, all of it sitting here, for 10 years of his life. While he wore hand-me-down shoes, 2 sizes too large, and was told to be grateful for the roof. The feeling in his chest didn't have a clean name. Not quite anger. Not quite grief. The particular sensation of seeing the dimensions of a hole you have been standing inside your whole life, for the first time seeing its walls. Hagrid said something encouraging. Harry turned away from the vault. He almost didn't notice when the change happened. Bill Weasley was 20 years old, and had spent the last 2 of them working Gringotts' Egyptian contracts, breaking curses that had been laid by people dead for 3 millennia. He'd been conducting a routine security sweep of the active vault gallery when the green smoke from Vault 687 rolled across his detection instruments. Instead of reading the vault's residual enchantments, the instrument pivoted to a living magical core nearby and registered the bindings layered across it. Bill had seen, in 2 years of professional curse-breaking, a maximum of 4 or 5 bindings on a single subject. The instrument was reading 61. He pressed 2 fingers to the calibration point. He read it again. Not clustered around a single source, which would mean 1 catastrophic curse. 61 separate bindings on 1 living magical core, some institutional, some old enough that their edges had softened, and one at the center of all of them that made the back of his neck prickle in a way that had nothing to do with the underground cold. He looked up. There was a boy standing in the doorway of Vault 687. Bill looked at the instrument. He looked at the boy. He looked at the instrument one more time. "Hold on," he said. His voice came out considerably more controlled than it felt. From Harry's side of the corridor, everything stopped. The goblin escort spoke quietly to Griphook in Gobbledygook. Griphook replied. Hagrid turned from the vault with the expression of a man whose very specific instructions had just become inadequate. His instructions, Harry knew distantly, were clear. Collect the package from Vault 7/1, which was done. Collect Harry's school funds from Vault 687, which was mostly done. Return Harry safely to the surface. He had not been given instructions for this, and the look on his broad face said so. The tall young man with the instrument crouched down to Harry's eye level. Long red hair pulled back in a ponytail, dragon-hide boots that had seen work, a small earring with a fang. He spoke in the careful, measured tone of someone choosing each word before it left his mouth. "My name is Bill Weasley. I work here." He paused. "There are some readings I need to document. From when the vault opened just now." Another pause. "Can you stay where you are for a moment?" Harry had spent 10 years being told to stay. He stayed. They were escorted upward through a narrow passage Harry hadn't used on the way down, through a door that Griphook opened with something that wasn't a key, and into a room made entirely of stone. Green light from wall brackets, a table, a single chair. Harry sat. He had his school money in his pocket. The thing from Vault 713 was in Hagrid's coat. He had not, today or on any previous day, done anything he could identify as wrong. He sat in the stone room and thought about that. He thought about all the times in 10 years he'd been told to stay in a room and wait and not ask questions and not be inconvenient. And he thought, this is familiar. This is the thing I know how to do. He wondered quietly what he could possibly have done wrong when he had been doing nothing at all for 11 years. But then, and this was different, he looked at the faces of the people in the room with him, and none of them looked bored. None of them looked inconvenienced. None of them had the expression of adults who wished he would simply be less trouble. Bill Weasley was looking at his instrument with the careful attention of someone trying not to show how much it mattered. Griphook had the stillness of a creature waiting for something important to be decided. Even Hagrid was watching Harry with something that looked uncomfortably close to guilt. For perhaps the first time in his life, Harry Potter was the most important person in a room. He was also the only one who didn't know why. He sat with his hands in his lap and waited to be told. The room they brought Harry to was smaller than seemed right for the number of people in it, and the table was larger than anything in it needed to be. Stone walls, iron brackets holding candles that burned without dripping, a smell of old mineral cold, and below that, something else Harry couldn't name, something like the inside of a very old clock. There was one chair. Harry sat in it. Hagrid stood, because nothing in the room had been built for a man of his proportions. Griphook took a position by the door and stayed there. Bill Weasley set his instruments on the table and did not sit. The Goblin elders arrived without announcement, 4 of them, entering in a line and moving with the specific economy of creatures who did not waste motion. They were older than Griphook, if Griphook had a countable age, in the way that stone is old, carrying a quality of accumulated weight that changed the air in the room when they occupied it. No one introduced them. No one appeared to think an introduction was needed. They arranged themselves around Harry's chair and began. The instruments were nothing like wands. The first was a length of dark material that bent the light around it without reflecting anything clearly. The second produced, when angled toward Harry's forehead, a sound at the very edge of hearing. Not quite a note, more like a question that expected no answer. The third was worked silver, and whatever had been worked into it moved even when the instrument was held still, slow and internal. When the goblin who carried it brought it close to Harry's forehead, he braced himself. Nothing hurt. That was the strangest part. He had lived his life under the assumption that when adults did things to him, those things were unpleasant. The examination was not. It was like being read rather than touched, like the instruments were turning pages inside him that he hadn't known were there. He sat very still and let them, and found, distantly, that he was not afraid. Bill watched the instruments and translated what they found, quietly, in a voice calibrated for information rather than reaction. The first thing they identified was also the worst, a foreign soul fragment fused to the scar on Harry's forehead, the oldest of the unintended bindings, Bill said, and the most dangerous. Not Harry's, someone else's. The goblins didn't yet know whose. Identifying the originating soul was a separate procedure. Bill said this in a tone that made it clear he had a suspicion he was keeping to himself. The second thing was different in quality entirely, a sacrificial counter-charm woven through Harry's magical core from outside it, ancient in the way that particular types of love magic were ancient, not because they were old, but because the kind of choice that created them happened rarely. Unmistakably cast in the act of willing death for another. Bill paused after he said that, and looked at Harry, and didn't look away immediately. "Old powerful magic," Bill said. "Whatever it isn't working against you." The third was a place and blood ward, tied to a specific dwelling and a living relative, requiring Harry to return to that dwelling each year or the ward would begin to degrade. The fourth was a governmental tracking charm, standard ministry practice for underage wizards, set to lift on his 17th birthday. And then there were 57 more. Most were institutional. Registration charms, enrollment notifications, ministry stamps of special status associated with a name that was, apparently, publicly significant. The goblins worked through them with professional attention and no visible opinion. It was the accumulation that made it strange, each binding small on its own, 57 of them together on a boy of 11 who had not, until the previous day, known that the word wizard applied to him. Bill turned to Hagrid when the count was confirmed. "Did you know about any of these?" He asked it quietly, without accusation, the way you ask a question hoping the answer will be simple and knowing it won't. Hagrid's great hands came up and covered his face. Then they came down again. He was not, Harry had understood within the first few minutes of knowing him, a man built for holding things in. He had placed Harry with the Dursleys. He had carried Harry there himself in November 1981, when the world had been wrong in every direction, and Sirius Black had been shouting in the dark, and Dumbledore had given him instructions, and he had followed them, because Dumbledore had given them, and because he'd believed. He used the word believed carefully, like something he was still deciding was true, that Harry would be safe. He had known about the Blood Ward in the general sense. Dumbledore had said there was a protection tied to Lily's blood running in her sister's family. Hagrid hadn't asked what the ward required of Harry in practice. He hadn't asked what it felt like to live under it. He had known nothing about a foreign soul fragment, nothing about 57 institutional stamps on a child's magical core. He said all of this looking at Harry, and the look on his face was the particular grief of someone who loves enormously, and has just discovered that his love has never been the same thing as information. "You're not the source of any of them," Bill said. It wasn't quite a comfort. It was accurate, which, in the circumstances, was something. Hagrid nodded once and said nothing more. Bill drew parchment toward him and wrote 2 letters. The first was to his father, Arthur Weasley, head of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office at the Ministry of Magic, who would be at his desk right now, and who had connections in places Bill didn't, and who needed to know what was coming before the official announcement made it everyone's business. Bill wrote it factual and short, what he'd found, what the Goblin elders had confirmed, and the words "extraordinary measures" underlined once. His father would understand what to do with that. The second letter was to Hogwarts, addressed to the headmaster. Bill wrote it in full, stated the facts without editorializing, and used the word immediate twice in the closing line. He thought twice was probably enough. He sent both letters with the Gringotts owl and watched it go, and then he looked back into the room. Harry was watching Hagrid. Hagrid was staring at the table. Harry waited until Hagrid's eyes came up and found his. Then he asked the only question he'd had since the mine cart, the one that had been sitting under everything else this whole time. "Did you know I was like this?" The answer, when it came, was not clean. Hagrid loved Harry. That was in every line of his enormous, unhappy face, in the way his hands moved and stilled, in the wet brightness of his beetle-black eyes. His love was not in question, but he'd had instructions, and he'd followed them because Dumbledore had given them, and what he said finally, in a very low voice, was that he'd done what Dumbledore told him, that he'd believed it was right. Harry sat with that. He thought about all the times in his life that he had been loved and misled simultaneously, and hadn't had a word for the combination. Petunia had said, in her way, that everything she'd done was for him. Vernon had said, in his way, that he was only being practical. Even now Hagrid was looking at him with enough love to be undeniable, and had still, 10 years ago, carried him to a cupboard he didn't know was a cupboard, and left him in it, because someone smarter had said to, being loved, and being told the truth. He'd assumed those things went together. He was 11 years old and sitting in a stone room in a Goblin bank, and he was only now understanding that they didn't have to, that love could be total and sincere and still leave you in the dark. He didn't say any of that. He looked at Hagrid's face, and Hagrid looked back, and somewhere above London a letter was already flying toward Hogwarts, asking the headmaster to come immediately, and Harry sat quietly in his chair and waited. Several hours passed. Bread arrived at some point, plain, the kind that tasted like the room it had been carried through, which was to say stone and cold. There was also water, in cups that were heavier than they looked. Hagrid ate his bread without appearing to taste it, and sat afterward with his enormous hands folded in his lap, not speaking. Harry had understood within the first few minutes of knowing him that Hagrid was not a person built for silence. The silence said everything his voice couldn't. Harry ate his bread and read the inscriptions on the walls, angular script, deliberate, in a language he didn't recognize, which might have been decorative or might have been a warning of the same general variety as the sign above the vault doors. He read them anyway. It was something to do. The letters were carved deeply, which suggested whoever had put them there had expected them to last. He was getting used to not understanding things in this place, and beginning to suspect that was going to be a feature of the wizarding world in general. Bill worked at the table. Goblin elders came and went, speaking to each other in gobbledygook, occasionally silent, occasionally pausing to look at Harry with the precise, impersonal attention of professionals doing a job. Nobody told him he could leave. Harry had spent his life not being told he could leave places. He read the inscriptions for the 3rd time and waited. He was reading them for the 4th time when Dumbledore arrived. The door opened, and the room changed. That was the only way Harry could describe it afterward. Not that something happened exactly, but that the room's relationship to itself shifted when Dumbledore walked in. He was very tall and very old, with long silver hair and a silver beard that reached the middle of his chest, and half-moon spectacles perched on a nose that had at some point been broken and healed at a slight angle. His robes were a deep blue that looked like they had opinions about color. He looked at everything in the room in a single unhurried sweep. Harry, Hagrid, Bill, the Goblin elders, the instruments on the table, and for a fraction of a second, before composure reasserted itself, he was surprised. Bill was the one who saw it. He watched it happen, and he wrote something brief at the margin of his papers. Then Dumbledore recovered, and he smiled, and the smile was warm and reached his eyes behind the half-moons, and he said, "Harry." Harry had been sitting in this stone room for several hours, thinking about instructions given and followed, and never questioned. He said nothing. He looked at Dumbledore's face and thought, "This is the person who wrote the instructions. This is the person Hagrid was following." He thought those things and didn't say them, because he was 11 and hadn't yet found the words for them. Bill presented the binding count. He read the list in order, and Dumbledore listened with his hands folded and his face in a stillness that was professional and careful. When Bill reached binding 2, the sacrificial counter-charm, the love magic, the ancient working cast in the act of willing death, Dumbledore's stillness changed quality. He said quietly that it was the greatest act of magic this century. He said it the way you speak about something that cannot be reduced by the act of naming it. For binding 3, the blood ward, he didn't hedge. He explained it clearly. A protection tied to Lily Potter's blood running through a living relative. As long as Harry called that house home and returned each year, the ward held. He had placed it himself. He described it as the most complete protection he had been able to devise for a child with no parents and a great many enemies, and the description carried the weight of a conviction rather than an apology. Binding 4, the trace, he addressed in a single sentence. Standard ministry practice, not his placement. He said this calmly and moved on. Then Bill came to binding 1. He described it as the instruments had a foreign soul fragment fused to the scar on Harry's forehead, the oldest of the unintended bindings, and, as the Goblin elders had assessed it, the most dangerous. Not Harry's. Something from outside, fused to him through the wound. He asked Dumbledore if the headmaster could account for it. There was a pause, long enough to have a shape, to take up space in the room the way objects do. The Goblin elders watched Dumbledore. Bill watched Dumbledore. Hagrid watched the table. Dumbledore said that some of his research into certain questions was not yet complete. He said he hoped to be in a position to address the matter more fully in time. He did not say, whose soul? He did not say, Horcrux. He did not say, Voldemort, though the name seemed to exist in the air of the room. Anyway, attached to nothing, belonging to nobody present, and to one person, very specifically, absent. Bill wrote something in the margin of his papers. The 57 institutional bindings Dumbledore accepted without defense. He called them the ordinary bureaucratic sediment of a famous child's registration in a frightened world. Ministry stamps and notifications and protections laid down by an institution that had been alarmed, and that had expressed its alarm in the way frightened institutions generally do. He had not placed them personally. Then it was the Goblin elder's turn, Bill translated. The elder spoke in measured phrases, each one precise, and Bill rendered them into English with the care of someone who understood that accuracy here carried consequences. The Goblin nation, the elder said, did not recognize the authority of the British ministry to layer magical restrictions on any person without that person's knowledge or consent, not on Goblin sovereign premises. What had been done to this child, 61 bindings on an 11-year-old who had been kept in ignorance of his own nature, who had believed himself ordinary, constituted a category of violation that the 1752 Goblin Accords had been established specifically to prevent. The Accords existed because history had demonstrated what the ministry would do, given latitude and fear as its tools. The senior council of the Goblin nation had already been summoned. The process could not be halted by any party now. Dumbledore received this with the expression of a man who had anticipated it, and who was still finding the reality of it larger than the anticipation. He said he understood. He said the concerns were legitimate. He inclined his head toward the Goblin elder, with the courtesy of someone who respected what he was being told and intended to respond to it, and he said it all with the measured neutrality of a man who was simultaneously, already, working through what came next. Everyone left the room eventually, except Harry and Dumbledore. It happened without arrangement. Bill and the Goblin elders stepped out to confer, and Hagrid went with them, perhaps sensing something about what the moment needed. And there was a space, brief, quiet, stone walls and candles that didn't drip, when it was only the old man and the boy. Dumbledore looked at Harry with an expression Harry couldn't fully read. Something between grief and something more considered, the expression of a man deciding how much of the truth to offer and in what form. "Everything I have done," Dumbledore said, "has been done to keep you safe." Harry thought about the blood ward and the trace and the bread and the stone room and the 10 years before any of this. Then he thought of a question. It was not a complicated question. It was the only one he had. "Is being safe the same as being free?" he asked. The room was quiet. Outside in the corridor there were voices, official and low, the sounds of a process that could not be halted. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. When he spoke, it was about complicated circumstances and choices made under incomplete information, and the genuine nature of the protections involved. All of this was probably true. Harry listened to it and recognized, with the steady clarity of someone who had spent 10 years learning to hear what adults were saying underneath what they said, that none of it was an answer. He didn't press. He sat with his hands in his lap, in the stone room, and he had asked his question, and Dumbledore had not answered it, and they both knew that, and they sat in that shared knowledge until Bill came back through the door, and the room was no longer just the two of them. They were escorted back to the main hall in a way that felt like a procession, though no one called it that. 3 goblins ahead, 3 behind, and in the middle, Harry, Hagrid, Bill, and Dumbledore, moving through the narrower upper corridors of the bank and into the familiar marble light of the lobby. The floor was polished, mirror-bright. The counter ran the length of the far wall. The chandeliers threw their warm gold light across a ceiling that had been built to reassure, and it was still doing that, even now, for the people who didn't yet know what was coming. There was a witch at the second counter with a pram. The child in it was asleep, and she was speaking with a goblin clerk about an account transfer, not looking up. 2 teenagers in robes stood near the entrance. 14, 15, Harry guessed, the age where you come to the bank with a parent's written permission and feel quite grown up about it. And they looked at the procession with idle curiosity, the look of people for whom this was not yet significant. The senior goblin who positioned himself at the head of the counter moved with the particular deliberateness of something that had not hurried in a very long time. He placed a piece of parchment on the surface before him, surveyed the lobby, and waited. The ambient noise of the room settled around him, not at any signal, but simply because the room understood that something was changing. He spoke first in Gobbledygook. Harry had never heard Gobbledygook. He understood immediately why it was called that. It was a language built apparently to sound unlike anything human, clicks and gutturals and sounds in registers that didn't sit easily in a human ear. It lasted several minutes, filling the marble hall completely. When it ended, the second goblin, standing slightly to the senior's left, translated. "The Goblin Nation," the translator said, in English as precise as cut stone, had this day conducted an examination of a living magical core on the premises of Gringotts Wizarding Bank. The examination had identified 61 separate magical bindings layered upon the core of an 11-year-old wizard, heir to an established vault of this institution, without that person's knowledge or consent. The Goblin Nation exercised sovereign authority over all examinations conducted on its premises. Gringotts was governed by goblin law and by no other authority, a state within a state by arrangement of the 1752 Goblin Accords, which this declaration hereby formally voided. The grounds for voiding were as follows. The 1752 Goblin Accords had been established to prevent a pattern of ministry conduct toward non-human peoples. That pattern had recurred, the detection of 61 bindings upon a minor, without consent or disclosure, on premises governed exclusively by goblin law, constituted a violation of the terms under which the Goblin Nation had agreed to cooperate with the British wizarding government. The Goblin Nation had granted the British ministry the benefit of good faith across 2 centuries. That benefit had now been exhausted. Underlying the present violation was the older and never-remedied grievance, the Wand Ban of 1631, in which the Wizards' Council, without a single goblin member among them, had stripped all non-human peoples of the right to carry a wand. The ban had stood for 360 years. It would be renegotiated as a condition of any new agreement. That grievance was reignited as of this date, effective immediately. Gringotts was closed to new transactions by human customers. Existing vault access was suspended. No Goblin would conduct business on behalf of the British Wizarding Ministry until a new agreement had been reached on terms acceptable to the Goblin nation. The translator finished. The silence that followed was the kind that descended in large marble rooms when the people inside them were working out what they had just heard. It was the witch at the counter who broke it. She asked, in a perfectly normal voice, whether she could still make her withdrawal. The Goblin clerk said no. She looked at the pram. She looked at the clerk. She said, in that same ordinary voice, "Thank you," and turned and walked to the door and pushed through it, and it shut behind her with a sound heavier than it should have been. The two teenagers looked at each other. Then one of them looked at Harry. Harry knew this look. It had followed him from the moment he'd walked into the leaky cauldron, and he'd learned to identify it by the way the eyes moved, starting at his face and dropping a fraction to his forehead. He watched the exact moment the connection assembled in the teenager's expression. The boy who lived in the lobby. 61 bindings, the bank, sealed. Harry held the look. There was nothing else to do. Bill stepped outside, while Dumbledore turned to confer with the Goblin Senior Council. The August afternoon was doing something honest and untroubled over Diagon Alley, and the alley had already noticed. It wasn't panic, not yet, but the crowd was moving differently, redistributing itself around a piece of news, the way water moved around a new obstacle, finding routes around it, and carrying it in all directions. Someone had a copy of the Daily Prophet, its front page rearranging itself in real time as the magical type chased the story. Bill heard the word Gringotts. He heard the word closed. He watched the words travel through the crowd the way magic moved, fast and unpredictable and changing shape as it went. He thought about his father, Arthur Weasley, 41 years old, head of the misuse of Muggle artifacts office, who had received Bill's letter this morning and was presumably occupying himself very thoroughly in the ministry corridors right now. His father had always understood, with the clear-eyed pragmatism of a man who had watched empires of tradition sustain themselves on very practical footings, that the wizarding world ran on Gringotts. Not on the ministry, not on Dumbledore, not on custom or precedent, or any of the things people preferred to believe kept the whole arrangement upright. On Goblin gold and Goblin trust. Bill thought about what he had found in the vault gallery. He thought about 61 bindings on an 11-year-old boy who hadn't known he was a wizard until the previous night. He did not think the goblins were wrong. The Minister for Magic arrived within the hour, which was fast even by ministry standards, and suggested someone had started moving before the announcement was finished. Cornelius Fudge came through the cleared entrance in a lime-green bowler hat and a pinstriped suit, and the expression of a man who had settled somewhere between the ministry and Diagon Alley, the question of whose fault this was. He found Dumbledore near the sealed counter and moved directly to him. He wanted to know why Dumbledore had allowed this to happen. He wanted to know why Dumbledore hadn't contained it. He used the word contained, which told Harry something about how the Minister for Magic thought about news. Dumbledore, who had been the calmest person in more rooms than Fudge had been in, said he hadn't allowed it. He said that what had been done to Harry Potter had been real, and that real things, when found, had consequences that could not be contained, only addressed. Fudge looked at Harry. It was the look of a man surveying a complication. Not hostile, exactly. More the expression of someone assessing how large a problem is and which direction to push it. Harry recognized it. He had been on the receiving end of that particular look for as long as he could remember. From Vernon, from teachers at school who didn't want the paperwork, from anyone who had encountered the gap between the trouble Harry seemed to attract and the effort they wanted to spend on it. He was used to it. But something had shifted in the last several hours. In the stone room and the marble lobby, and the long wait with Hagrid's silence and Dumbledore's non-answers, and the expression on Fudge's face, which would have been simply familiar yesterday, was now also infuriating in a way Harry didn't quite have words for yet. It was the word managed. He was beginning to understand that he was being managed, had always been being managed, and that there was a difference between that and being considered. Eventually they were moved toward the entrance. Harry walked out of Gringotts through the heavy doors and stood at the top of the broad marble steps. Diagon Alley opened out below him, buzzing with news he had created by existing in the wrong place and being the wrong sort of problem. The bank's doors were sealed behind him, actually sealed, closed to the wizarding world for the first time in the history anyone here could remember. He had his school money in a small pouch in his pocket. He had no wand. He had no robes. He had no map for what came next. He stood on the steps and thought, for the first time in his life, neither does anyone else. The leaky cauldron in the evening had the quality of a place that had heard something and was sitting with it. The usual crowd was thinner. The conversations were lower. The barman moved glasses around behind the counter without particular purpose. Someone in the corner had a copy of the Daily Prophet folded to the front page, and two witches at the bar were talking in the compressed, careful way of people who didn't want to be overheard. Hagrid chose the table furthest from the door, which was a choice that required some optimism given his proportions, and he ordered tea, and he sat. Harry sat across from him. The pot arrived. Neither of them touched it. "Right," Hagrid said. "Well." He tried several times to explain the problem. Each time he got part-way through, the blood ward, the protection tied to Lily's blood in Petunia's family, the fact that it required Harry to go back, each summer, to a place that called itself home. And then he stopped. Started again. Stopped. The problem was this. Dumbledore needed Harry to return to Privet Drive. The ward required it. But the Goblin Nation had, 4 hours ago, stood in the marble lobby of Gringotts and named that ward publicly as part of the binding complex that had been layered on Harry without consent. If Dumbledore now sent Harry back to Privet Drive, the act would be read by the goblins, by the Ministry, by everyone who had been in that lobby or read that afternoon's Prophet, as the British wizarding government saying, "We hear your objection, and we choose to ignore it." Every choice was visible now. Every choice had become a statement. Hagrid stirred his tea without drinking it. He looked at Harry over the rim of the cup with his great beetle-black eyes, which were doing something that Harry had not expected them to do. "Why Privet Drive?" Harry asked. "Why was it ever the answer?" Hagrid set the cup down. He explained, with the careful sadness of someone reporting on decisions he'd believed in, and was now examining from a new angle what he understood of it. Dumbledore had believed it was the safest place in Britain for Harry. Lily's blood, running in her sister's veins, powered the protection. It wasn't just a hiding place. It was a magical guarantee, a charm that had kept Voldemort from being able to touch Harry as long as he lived there. Dumbledore had been certain. Hagrid had trusted the certainty. "He made me sleep in a cupboard," Harry said. Hagrid went very still. "Under the stairs," Harry said. "For the first 10 years. They moved me to Dudley's second bedroom after the letters started coming." The silence was quite long. Hagrid's hands, which had been wrapped around the cup, moved slowly to the surface of the table and stayed there. His beetle-black eyes had gone very bright, and he was clearly working hard at something, at keeping his voice level, at staying in his chair, at the general project of not expressing what he felt in the way his body was inclined to express it, which would have involved something structural and probably criminal. He had carried Harry there. He had stood on the doorstep of a house in Little Whinging with a sleeping baby and trusted Dumbledore's word about safe, and he hadn't asked what safe meant in practice for a child with no one to speak for him. "I didn't know," Hagrid said. It came out low. "I want you to know that. I didn't know about the cupboard." "I know you didn't," Harry said. "But I should have—" "You didn't know," Harry said again. Hagrid nodded, slowly, and said nothing more about it, and the tea went cold. Across the city, in a private room above the sealed Gringotts lobby, Dumbledore was finding the path forward from a narrower set of options than he had begun the day with. Sending Harry back to Privet Drive was not possible. The Blood Ward had been named. The act of reinstating it now would be read as defiance of the Goblin Declaration, and defiance at this stage would cost more than the ward was worth. He accepted this without sentiment. He was very old, and he had made many choices, and he had learned to distinguish the ones he could still hold from the ones that had already slipped. He could not leave Harry in Diagon Alley. The boy was 11 years old and had no wand. He shaped a Patronus. It took, as it always did, the form of a phoenix, burning bright and silent, the kind of light that did not need permission from its surroundings, and he sent it north. To Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress at Hogwarts. The message was brief. Prepare the school for an early guest. She would not need more than that. She never did. Then he went back in to continue talking to the Goblin Council and the Minister for Magic, and the conversations continued to be difficult. At the Burrow, in Ottery St. Catchpole, Devon, the evening owl came before the prophet, which was unusual. Ron Weasley was in the garden when it arrived, and he came in to find his mother and father at the kitchen table with a letter that had Bill's handwriting on the outside. His mother had a look on her face that she sometimes got when something had gone wrong, and she had decided that the way to address it was to make tea and think about it hard. Ron had already read the headline in the evening, Prophet on the way in. Gringotts closed. Goblin Nation voids, 1752. Accords. Boy who lived at center of diplomatic crisis. He sat down across from his father. "What did Bill find?" he asked. His father folded the letter into his breast pocket and looked at Ron in the particular way that meant, "I'm going to answer this, but not fully, and I would like you to accept that for now." "It's complicated," Arthur said. Ron was 11. He had been 11 long enough to know that complicated was the word adults used for terrible when there were children in the room. He thought about Harry Potter, a name he'd known his whole life without ever attaching it to an actual person, and about a boy who had spent yesterday not knowing he was a wizard, and had apparently, by this afternoon, closed a bank and started a diplomatic crisis, without having a wand. He looked at his mother's face. He looked at his father's pocket where the letter was. He didn't ask again. The shops in Diagon Alley were still open when Harry and Hagrid made their way through. The crisis had closed Gringotts, not the rest of it. Madame Malkin's was lit, Flourish and Blots had its display in the window, the apothecary was grinding something that smelled strongly of overripe fruit. Harry walked past all of it without stopping. He had a pouch of galleons, and no wand and no robes, and he was going somewhere that was not the Dursleys, and that fact was so new and so strange that there wasn't much room inside it for shopping. The carriages waited at the edge of the alley, where the wizarding world met the Muggle one. 4 of them, black-lacquered, lamp-lit at the corners. The shafts were occupied by something. Harry could see the harnesses moving, the straps settling under a weight. the particular stillness of something alive that was simply waiting. But he could not see what was in them. The shafts appeared to be attached to empty air. The carriages appeared to move under their own inclination. He stood and looked at this for a moment. He knew, distantly, that the carriages had brought people here and would take him back, that there was an explanation that everyone else seemed to accept, that he was probably missing something obvious. But there was also the possibility that it was just how things were. Carriages that moved by themselves, vaults that breathed green smoke, a world that had been there all along. He climbed in. The carriage moved. He didn't look back at the alley. Hogwarts in August was nothing like Harry had imagined. He had imagined something like Diagon Alley, loud and crowded and full of itself, a place that knew it was extraordinary and made certain you agreed. What he found instead was the quality of a very large building that was not performing for anyone. The entrance hall was vast and torchlit and cool, the stone walls the particular grey of things that have never needed to be another colour. The staircases went up into the dark. The portraits on the walls were mostly asleep. The sudden sleep of people who had been watching the doors for years and had given up for the evening and slumped sideways in their frames. Harry's footsteps echoed in a way that implied the corridor was tallying them. Minerva McGonagall had been standing at the door. She was a tall woman, with black hair shot through with grey, pulled tightly back, square spectacles on a sharp face, and the upright carriage of someone who had made posture into a position. She had shaken his hand, formally, not warmly, which Harry found, to his own surprise, preferable to warmth, and led him inside without ceremony. She asked whether he had eaten. He said yes, which was not entirely true, but true enough. She did not press. She showed him to a room on the 3rd floor, a 4-poster bed with hangings, a window that looked over the grounds, a desk and a wardrobe and a rug on the stone floor. It was the largest space that had ever been assigned to Harry for the purpose of sleeping in it. He crossed the room and ran his hand along the post of the bed. The wood was old and smooth and absolutely solid. He stood there with his hand on it, not saying anything. McGonagall, from the doorway, said nothing either. She was not, he could see, a person who filled silences with comfort as a general practice. She told him breakfast was at 8, and that she was available should he need anything. She said good night as though she meant it, and pulled the door closed. Harry stood in the middle of his room and listened to the castle breathe. Severus Snape was called to the headmaster's office the following afternoon. He had spent 10 years training himself to hear information without visible response. A spy's most basic discipline. Nothing crosses the face. Nothing changes in the hands. The voice remains at the same pitch it entered the room with. He had learned this during the war, refined it after, and in 10 years of covert service he had maintained it through interrogations, through information he had not wanted to carry. Dumbledore placed a single piece of parchment on the desk, the binding list. Snape read it. He read it again. Then he set it down, and his hands stayed where they were, flat against the desk, and he looked at the headmaster. The first thing that broke his composure was the soul fragment. He had seen during the war what Voldemort did to souls, not abstractly, in practice. He did not need the word Horcrux spelled out for him to understand what a foreign soul fragment fused to a child's scar meant, or what the creation of such a thing required. He looked at it on the parchment and felt something controlled slip. The second thing was Lily's protection, the counter-charm, the sacrificial working, the love magic, the act of dying for. She had died for the boy. The instruments had confirmed it. The binding was there, unmistakable. Lily Evans had seen Voldemort coming and had said no in the most absolute way available to her. And it had worked. Snape had known she was dead for 10 years. He had not known until this moment, the exact shape of what she had done in those final seconds, and the shape of it, rendered in the cold terms of a curse-breaker's instrument, was something he was not prepared for. He said nothing. The third thing was the blood ward, and it was the blood ward that finally moved him to speak. Because the blood ward was Dumbledore's, placed deliberately, designed to function through Lily's blood running in her sister's family, and Snape could see with complete clarity what the ward had required in practice. A child with magical capacity, registered and noted and stamped across 57 institutional records as a person of extraordinary status, maintained at a specific Muggle address, legally obligated to call that address home. The ward had been constructed around him. He had not been inside it. He had been it. "How many of the 57, Snape said, "did you know about?" "I knew the blood ward existed," Dumbledore said. "The registration charms and special status notifications were placed by ministry departments. I did not oversee them personally. That," Snape said very quietly, "is a distinction without a difference. I made the best decision available to me given." "He has spent 10 years, Snape said, with a piece of Voldemort's soul on his forehead. The control in his voice was the kind that came not from absence of feeling, but from refusing to allow feeling to make the feeling larger than the sentence. A soul fragment. In the wound Voldemort left him for 10 years, and you have known, or suspected, that this was possible." The pause was significant. "I have been researching the matter," Dumbledore said. "Researching." Snape looked at the binding list. He looked at the word fragment. He looked back at Dumbledore. "You have allowed a child to go 10 years in ignorance of his own nature, in a house he cannot leave, under a protection woven from his mother's death, with a foreign soul fragment in his forehead, and you have been researching." Dumbledore did not answer. His eyes were very steady behind the half-moon spectacles, and his hands were folded in his lap with the composure of a man who had already processed more of this grief than Snape had access to, and who knew that composure was not, in this moment, the same as being in the right. The silence told Snape everything he had needed confirmed. It was not for Harry's sake that Snape felt it. He wanted to be clear about that, if only internally. He did not love the boy. He had spent a decade carefully not loving the boy, not because the boy had done anything wrong, but because the boy had a face that bore certain resemblances, and eyes the color of someone Snape was not willing to revisit. His fury was Lily's. It was on her behalf, for what she had done, and what had been done with the outcome of what she had done. She had died for this. She had cast the most expensive magic in the catalogue of sacrificial workings, and the thing it was supposed to protect had been left at a Muggle house with a piece of Voldemort still in it, and Dumbledore had known the possibility for years and said nothing. Neither man named, tonight, what this meant for what came next. They did not need to. Snape took the parchment and left. Harry was not supposed to be in that corridor. He had been exploring the upper corridors, taking staircases he hadn't used before, and had found himself in a part of the castle he didn't recognize. Stone gargoyle on a plinth, a spiral staircase behind it. He would have kept going, except that the gargoyle's plinth was directly adjacent to the only lit doorway in the corridor, and through the doorway, barely, he could hear voices. Not what they said, the tenor of it. A voice he didn't know. Controlled, cold, quiet in the way that quiet can be louder than volume, and Dumbledore's voice, lower than it had been with Harry, the voice of a man who was receiving something without deflecting it. He heard a foreign soul fragment. He heard Privet Drive. He heard, just once, in a sentence whose surrounding context he couldn't make out. Lily's son. He stood very still. He didn't know what a soul fragment meant. He didn't know what the cold voice was accusing Dumbledore of, specifically. He knew, from the shape of the conversation, from the way the controlled voice cut the sentences into pieces that were smaller than their content, the way Dumbledore's answers fell shorter as the conversation went on, that whatever was being said about him was not ordinary, that whatever had been done to him had, somewhere, a person who found it unforgivable. He didn't know who that was. He didn't know why. He walked back to his room through the dark corridor. The portrait nearest him had been asleep for some time. It was snoring lightly, a small sound, absurd in the stone emptiness. Harry went past it, and down the staircase, and through the hall where his footsteps still counted themselves, and he climbed into the four-poster bed with the good solid post, and lay there in the dark. His mother's name was Lily. It was the only thing about her he had ever reliably known. He had heard it tonight, spoken in anger, in a voice that made the anger sound like something more than anger, and he lay there in the dark and thought about what it meant to be spoken for by a person you had never been able to meet. The letter from Gringotts arrived on his second day back in London, which was fast even by Goblin standards. Bill read it twice, sitting at the desk in the small room above the leaky cauldron that the bank had arranged for him, and found that it said what he had expected it to say: Egypt rotation suspended, effective immediately, reassigned to the London branch as primary human curse-breaker interface for the duration of the Council's investigation. Duration unspecified. He was to report to the London Gringotts senior Goblin on Monday. He was also reminded, in a footnote, that this reassignment came with a pay adjustment, which he had not expected. He sat with it and felt two things: relief and his mother's face. He wrote to the borough. Not the full account. That would take a week and a great deal of patience on both sides, and his mother's patience, in situations involving any of her children in proximity to danger, was not one of her more developed qualities. He wrote that he was fine, that his work had moved from Egypt to London, that things were in motion and he was part of them. He said not to worry. He addressed it to his father and mother both, and added a line at the bottom that said, Ron should know he'd be seeing some interesting things in the Prophet this year. He sent it with the certain knowledge that the words not to worry would cause his mother to worry more intensely than if he had said nothing. Harry had been at Hogwarts for a week when Bill arrived. He had spent the days learning the castle's logic, the staircases that moved, the portraits that commented, the way each corridor had its own particular smell and temperature and personality. McGonagall had given him a schedule of sorts: meals at fixed hours, access to the library, no access to the restricted section, no wandering after dark. He had observed most of these. When Bill came through the entrance hall with a Gringotts document wallet under one arm and his red hair still in the same road-worn ponytail, Harry felt something loosen slightly in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. "You're here," Harry said. "I'm here," Bill said. "I thought it would be, I don't know, different people." Bill set the wallet down on the bench in the hall and looked at him properly. "How are you doing?" Harry considered this. "You're the first person I've seen in a week who isn't a portrait or 60 years old." "Dumbledore's 110. That's what I said." "McGonagall." 55, Harry said, then thought about that. "I mean, that's ancient, I know." Bill picked up the wallet. "I'm 20, by the way. That's basically ancient compared to 11. Bill considered this for a moment, with the expression of someone who had expected to win this exchange and had not. "Fair enough," he said, and they went to find Snape. The classroom they used was on the ground floor, with a long table and windows that faced north. The light was the flat, even kind that didn't commit to warmth in any direction. Bill spread the binding list across the table. Snape stood opposite him with his arms folded and his black robes entirely still, which was a posture Harry had come to recognize as Snape preparing to disagree with something. They classified the bindings in order. The first, the soul fragment, Snape and Bill addressed in parallel, arriving at the same conclusion from different starting points without looking at each other. Any removal attempt without specific preparation and a specialist assessment by the Goblin Council could rupture the binding catastrophically. A Horcrux fragment was not a curse in the conventional sense. It had properties of a living thing, and living things, when removed incorrectly, caused damage proportional to how badly the removal was done. Bill noted it in the column labeled Inert Pending Specialist Consultation and moved on. The second was Lily's protection. Bill wrote it under the Preservation column. Snape, looking at the binding description in his characteristic way, as though reading something that said more in the margins than the center, said nothing. The countercharm was not a suppressive binding, and was not constrictive of Harry's magical capacity. It was, in the clinical language of the classification exercise, a shield woven from the oldest kind of sacrifice. Bill wrote it down and looked at Snape, and Snape gave the brief, singular nod of a man agreeing to something that was not, in this particular instance, in dispute. It was the only point in the session they reached without argument. The Blood Ward was the third. Protective, Bill said, but also location binding. It had always required Harry to return to Privet Drive, to call it home, to maintain the tie. Since Harry was here, and not there, the ward had already begun to degrade on its own. The question was whether to actively end it or document the lapse and let it complete naturally. Snape said, with the voice of someone articulating a preference they have already decided on, that accelerating the degradation of a ward that was also the only thing standing between the boy and any Death Eater who knew where he lived seemed premature. Bill said the ward had already been publicly named and had lost most of its ambient concealment the moment the Goblin Council announced the binding complex. Another silence. Snape said to document the lapse and note the security implications. Bill wrote both down. The trace was forth. Bill flagged it and moved it to a separate column. Ministry business, not for Cursebreaker intervention, not while the ministry was in its current phase. The remaining 57 came apart into clusters with the methodical efficiency of a project that had been waiting for someone with the technical vocabulary to approach it correctly. Removal could begin at the lowest impact end. Basic registration notifications, duplicated status charms, administrative flags placed by ministry departments that had long since stopped looking at Harry Potter's file. Work upward from there. Document each removal for the Goblin Council. Bill scheduled the first removal session for the following morning. Harry sat in the classroom for 2 hours while Bill worked. There was nothing to see. No light, no smoke, no dramatic indicator that anything was changing. Bill moved his instruments over Harry's forehead in careful overlapping passes, reading the bindings with more precision than they had managed in the vault corridor, and beginning, very slowly, to undo part of what was there. When it was done, Harry said, "Is that it?" "That's the first cluster," Bill said. 11 bindings. We'll do the next cluster in 3 days. Harry walked out into the corridor. He couldn't have said what was different. The proportions of the corridor were the same. The stone was the same temperature. He felt the way you feel on a morning when the barometric pressure has shifted overnight. The same world, but the air had changed its weight, and his body hadn't quite recalibrated. That evening after dinner, he sat alone in the classroom where the work had been done. He had been practicing Lumos for 3 days with a borrowed wand, a spare from the school stores, nothing he was meant to keep. and the results until now had been dim and inconsistent. He tried it. The light that came from the wand's tip was approximately 3 times brighter than it had been yesterday. He sat with it for a long time, the lit wand in his hand, the classroom going white around him, wondering what 11 years of other people's decisions about what he should be capable of might have looked like from the inside. He put it out before anyone came. From the corridor doorway, Snape watched. He had not intended to be there. He had come to retrieve a text left on the classroom table, had seen the light under the door, and had looked in before he understood what he was doing. The boy had Lily's eyes. This was a fact Snape had been professionally managing for years, in preparation for the moment he would have to look at them in a classroom every week. And he had believed himself prepared. He was, he found, less prepared than he had thought. The boy was sitting in the white light of a lumos that was considerably stronger than an untrained 11-year-old's ought to be, and the expression on his face was not triumph, but something more uncertain, the look of a person discovering that a room is larger than they were told. Lily's eyes, James Potter's face, the magic that should have been his from the beginning, just now finding its proper size. Snape retrieved his text and walked back to his dungeons. He did not think about the boy. He thought about the Horcrux fragment, which no one else in this castle was positioned to address. He pulled the restricted section key from his desk drawer. He would start with what had been written. Whatever the text said, he would know more by morning than he had known tonight, and he intended to keep knowing more until he understood what it would take. He began to read. Platform 9 3/4 was everything Ron Weasley had been told it was, and also considerably louder. His mother was moving at the speed she always moved at when she had several children, and a departure time and a trolley. Percy was already ahead, having located his prefect badge that morning, and not stopped finding reasons to touch it since. Fred and George had vanished into the crowd somewhere near the barrier, which meant they were either helping someone or doing something they would deny helping with. Ron navigated the steam and the trunks and the owls, and found a spot near the train where he could see without being in anyone's way. He had known more than the other first years going into September. Bill's letters from London had been short and carefully partial. He hadn't said everything, not by a long distance, but their father worked at the ministry, and for a month the Gringotts closure had been in every conversation, in every corridor of their home. Ron knew that Gringotts had been sealed. He knew there were Goblin delegations at the ministry every other Tuesday. He knew that a treaty from 1752 had been voided over a list of bindings on a boy who hadn't known he was a wizard until the day it happened. He knew Harry Potter was already at Hogwarts. This information had been sitting with him all summer, and he had expected to feel the way he usually felt about Harry Potter, which was the way most Wizarding World children felt, a kind of reverential remove, the sense of looking at a name rather than a person. What he actually felt, standing on the platform while the express shuddered steam and his mother pressed sandwiches into his hands, was something more like ordinary curiosity. Because, from what Bill had said, Harry Potter had come to Gringotts to pick up school money and had walked into a situation that didn't have a precedent. That was not what celebrities did. That was what people did. He boarded the train. He found a compartment. He sat down and thought about chess and whether anyone at Hogwarts would be any good. Harry had been sorted in August, not on the stool in the Great Hall, not in front of the assembled school. In Dumbledore's office, a private sorting, the 3 of them alone. Harry, Dumbledore, and the hat. The hat had taken a long time. It had said things, in the silence inside the brim where only Harry could hear, that Harry had not repeated to anyone since, and did not intend to. He was Gryffindor. He knew that much. He sat at the table now and watched the doors open and the first year's file in. He found Ron Weasley without difficulty. The hair. Bill's hair, pulled in toward a taller, gawkier version of the same boy, with freckles and an expression of someone trying not to look nervous and achieving it imperfectly. He watched Ron stand under the hat, watched the hat announce Gryffindor with a confidence that suggested it had not deliberated at length, and watched Ron take his seat at the table with the relieved face of someone who had been told the answer to a question they'd been carrying since summer. Hermione Granger came later in the alphabet, a girl with bushy brown hair and the upright posture of someone who had already memorized the Hogwarts school charter and found several items to query. She answered a question the sorting hat appeared to be asking her before it had fully finished asking it. The hat sorted her into Gryffindor immediately, with the decisive quality of a problem already solved. Neville Longbottom nearly sat on the hat. He looked, from across the room, like someone who expected bad news, and when the hat shouted Gryffindor he startled visibly, and then stood up with the expression of a person revising an expectation they had held for a very long time. Harry watched all three of them take their seats. He did not know yet what any of them would be to him. He knew, in the general way that you know things from watching a room, that the year was assembling itself around him. When McGonagall reached the P's and called out, "Potter, Harry James," the great hall produced a sound. He was accustomed to versions of this sound: the leaky cauldron, the bank lobby, the marble steps outside Gringotts, as the crowd read the afternoon prophet. He knew the register of a room recognizing him. What was different this September was the second layer. Not just boy who lived, but Gringotts. He could see it moving through the older students from left to right, as recognition assembled. The scar, and then the bank, and then, on several faces, the particular expression of people who had spent a month unable to access their vault, and had just worked out who to look at about it. He was 11. He had not asked for any of the things he was held accountable for. He had been feeling, since August, the growth of a specific tiredness, the tiredness of being defined by something that had happened before he had formed an opinion about anything. He stood, crossed to the stool, sat under the hat, and felt the familiar pressure of a mind that had already had its thoughts examined by this particular object and had nothing new to conceal. The hat confirmed his house in a sentence, and he went to his seat. The feast materialized. The noise resumed. Harry ate and said very little. The first-year dormitory smelled of stone and new wood and someone's owl, and 6 beds had been divided from each other by their curtains in the tacit agreement of people who were strangers sharing territory. Ron Weasley chose the bed across from Harry's with the decisiveness of someone who had thought about it and decided on a direction. They sat in the way of people who have just been placed in a room together by an institution and are deciding whether to make anything of it. "My brother Bill says," Ron began, and stopped and started again. "He said you have more magic than they could measure, because it's been buried." Harry looked at him. He was aware that Bill Weasley had found the bindings, had written letters, and had a brother who had clearly been reading those letters with care. He was also aware that this was the most direct thing any person his own age had said to him in the last month. "He's not wrong," Harry said. "I'm not trying to make it weird," Ron said. "It's not weird." A pause. "It's strange that it's not weird." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a first night in a dormitory. Tentative, provisional, the kind 2 people can choose to leave as silence or make into something else. Outside, the Scottish hills were doing whatever Scottish hills did in September, which appeared to involve wind. "Do you play chess?" Ron asked. "I don't know how." Something happened to Ron's face. It was the expression of a person who has just been given a problem they are entirely confident they can solve. "I'll teach you," he said, as if the matter were closed, and got up to dig his set out of his trunk. By the third week of term, Harry had noticed a pattern in charms. Hermione Granger had read ahead. She had read well ahead, past where they were, around the corner, into where they would be in November. And the consequence was that in any class where a question was asked, she knew the answer before the professor had finished asking. Harry, who had spent his life being told he was wrong about things he knew he was right about, found he had a specific and wordless appreciation for this. He could not have explained it. It was something like recognition. She did not notice him noticing. He decided that was probably fine for now. He could feel it changing. The awareness came during a defense class in the third week of September, which was, for Quirrell, the kind of irony that would have amused him in another life. He was standing at the front of the room explaining the theory of counter-jinxes, and the back of his head was paying attention to something else entirely. The soul fragment had always been there, anchored in the scar since 1981, fused to the boy through a killing curse that had turned back on itself. Voldemort knew better than anyone what was in that wound, because he had put it there without intending to. For 10 years it had been insulated, muffled, surrounded by the suppressive weight of 60-some bindings that had sat on the boy's magical core like sediment. Irritating, but stable. It was less stable now. He could feel the clarity of the link improving, which was not an improvement. More of the fragment was exposed, reachable, and that meant more of the fragment could be reached from outside. If the goblins understood what they were looking at, and they were old enough and methodical enough that he had to assume they did, then his window was contracting. The Philosopher's Stone was in this castle. He had been moving toward it carefully, at a pace he had calculated against the boy's apparent safety. He would need to recalculate. In front of the class, Quirrell's voice continued its explanation, stuttering gently at the difficult words, the turban shifting slightly as the weight at the back of his head resettled. He paid close attention to Harry Potter for the rest of the lesson. The letter from the Goblin Senior Council arrived at Hogwarts on the 14th of October. Dumbledore read it twice, which was not his usual practice. He set it on the desk and looked at it for a moment, before he read it a third time. The proposal was formal and carefully worded, the product, he suspected, of a great deal of internal goblin debate about how much to put in writing and how much to leave for the conversation. The council had identified the foreign soul fragment as the remnant of a dark wizard's deliberate fragmentation of his own soul. They did not use the word Horcrux. Goblin scholarship on the practice had its own terminology and its own tradition, and he did not expect them to use his vocabulary. The identification, by whatever name they used, was accurate. What they were offering was the distinction he had not, in 10 years of research, managed to arrive at on his own. Detection, the letter said, was passive. It had required only Harry's presence in the bank for the instrument to read the fragment. Extraction was entirely different. Extraction was active, invasive, and required months of preparation, specialist goblin metal magic work on the boundary between the material and the magical, and this was underlined in the precise way of people who understood the weight of what they were underlining, the informed consent of the person being extracted from. The Goblin Nation would conduct the extraction. In exchange, they asked for one documented concession. Senior Gringotts staff, authorized to conduct magical examinations, would be permitted to carry wands for the purpose of those examinations. A limited, documented, and scope-specific modification of the wand ban of 1631. Dumbledore had kept the Horcrux question private for years for a reason he was not comfortable examining too closely. He had not been certain, had never been fully certain whether destroying the soul fragment meant destroying Harry. Every path he had found through his own research had led him to an answer he was unwilling to use. The extraction offer, taking the fragment out rather than destroying it in place, separating it from its host rather than unmaking it, was a distinction he hadn't had. He sat with it and felt, quietly and without any comfortable way to describe it, that he had just been given something that should have been found years ago. He sent a message to Snape. He had been sending messages to Snape more frequently since August. That was probably appropriate. Bill Weasley came to Hogwarts on a Saturday in late October, carrying a Gringotts document wallet and wearing a jacket that had seen better decades. He found Ron at the Gryffindor table at breakfast and sat down across from him with the easy authority of the eldest Weasley sibling, who had always understood that authority in this family meant showing up and doing the thing, rather than announcing that you were about to. Harry was sitting beside Ron, which appeared to be where Harry spent a significant portion of time. Bill looked at both of them. He had seen Harry last in a stone chamber in a Goblin bank, and before that, in a vault corridor with instruments telling him things he had not expected. He had thought about that corridor a great deal in the weeks since. "I need to explain something to you," he said to Harry. "The goblins want to help with the thing in your scar. The fragment. They've made a formal proposal, and Dumbledore has agreed you should hear it directly." Harry set down his fork. Bill explained the extraction proposal in the terms he had been using in his own letters. Carefully accurate, stripped of the vocabulary that would require 2 hours of additional context. There was something fused to Harry's scar that didn't belong to him. The goblins, who worked magic that ran along the boundary between metal and living things, believed they could remove it. Not destroy it where it was. Remove it. Take it out whole. Separate it from him. The process would take months of preparation and would not begin until Harry said yes. "What if I say no?" Harry asked. "Then nothing starts," Bill said. "Nothing changes. It stays as it is." Harry thought about this. He had the expression he got, Bill had noticed, when he was thinking about something that went past the words available for it. "That's not a nothing," Harry said. "Saying no means choosing to leave it there." "Yes," Bill said. "It does." They sat with that for a moment. The great hall moved around them. Saturday noise, second helpings, someone at the Ravenclaw table dropping a pitcher. "I'll say yes," Harry said. "I just wanted to understand what the choice was." Bill nodded and wrote something in the wallet. He stayed for another hour, talking to Ron about the Chudley cannons and not mentioning Gringotts again, which Harry seemed to find restful. After Bill left, Ron and Harry took their usual chairs in the corner of the Gryffindor common room. The fire was the Saturday kind, built up, unhurried, doing warmth as a project rather than a necessity. Ron was watching Harry without being obvious about it, which was a skill he had learned from living with Fred and George and honing through chess. Harry was not frightened. Ron knew what frightened looked like. It was a specific quality, tightness across the face, and a stillness in the hands that was not patience, but its opposite. Harry had none of that. He was staring at the fire the way Ron stared at a board when he had just understood where the game was going. That was the thing. Ron had been waiting for Harry to look frightened, because if someone told Ron there was a foreign soul fragment in his forehead and a Horcrux extraction process being planned for next year, he expected he would be frightened. Harry just looked like he was thinking. Ron knew the difference from chess. A frightened person wanted to escape the board, wanted the game to be over before it resolved. A thinking person wanted to understand the position. Harry wasn't looking for an exit. He was looking at the whole board. "Are you all right?" Ron asked. Harry glanced at him. I think so. A pause. I've known something was wrong since August. It's better to know what it is. Ron didn't have anything to add to that. He picked up the chessboard and started setting up pieces. Harry, by now, knew how all of them moved. McGonagall came for Neville during herbology, which was the one class he'd been managing without incident. He was good at herbology. He knew where the plants wanted to be held and what they responded to, and the greenhouse was quiet in a way that suited him, warm and green and smelling of earth, and something just below rot that you stopped noticing after 5 minutes. He had been careful and correct all morning. When McGonagall appeared at the greenhouse door and asked to speak with him privately, the good morning curdled in his chest in the way it always did when someone in authority wanted him specifically. He followed her inside, through the castle, to a small room on the 2nd floor he had not been in before. Bill Weasley was there, with his instruments on the table and his document wallet, and the expression of a person who was about to have a careful conversation. Neville sat down across from him. He recognized the instruments from the talk that had moved through Gryffindor in September. Goblin made, reading magical cores, the same ones that had found Harry's 61 bindings in the bank. He looked at the table and waited for whatever the bad news was. The examination was not painful. That was the first thing he noticed. And he noticed it the way you notice the absence of something you had braced for. Bill moved the instruments with the careful overlapping passes he had apparently developed over a year of vault work in Egypt, and the room was quiet, and nothing hurt. 12, Bill said, when he was finished. Neville looked at him. Bill explained. There were ministry protection charms placed on Neville shortly after January 1982. Neville would have been about 1.5 years old, which was not a coincidence, because January 1982 was when his parents had been hospitalized. The ministry, when a wizarding child's parents were permanently incapacitated by a dark wizard act, had a protocol. Protection was placed on the child without asking at the child, because the child was not old enough to ask. There were also Longbottom family wards, placed by his grandmother's household, which had apparently been extensive. And there were institutional bindings from the period when Neville's magical status had been uncertain, when the assessment records from his early childhood had noted, in careful ministry language, that his core readings were inconclusive. 12. Bill said it again, like the number meant something in itself, because it did. He also said, 12 and not 61. He looked at Neville directly and said that the difference in scale was not a difference in method. The method was the same. Bindings placed by institutions and families on children they considered vulnerable or valuable, without asking. But Harry's history was extraordinary in a way that had drawn extraordinary weight. The pattern was the same. The proportion was different. You have 12 more bindings than any child should have, Bill said. The number that's unusual is 12, not 61. Neville nodded. He was already thinking. He had always suspected, somewhere below where he kept things that were comfortable to examine, that the problem was not entirely him. He had spent years being the Longbottom boy who couldn't quite, the boy who nearly didn't get a wand to respond, the boy the family had worried about and tested, and, he was old enough now to name it just barely, managed. He had been managed. The Sorting Hat had put him in Gryffindor, and he had startled because he had never, in his internal accounting of himself, put himself in that column. He had always assumed the column was for people who were simply braver than he was, rather than for people who had been making themselves small for years, and had not yet understood it. Bill was saying that 12 bindings had been placed on him when he was too young to agree or refuse. The emotion that came up was not simple. It had validation in it, the relief of a person whose suspicion about a room's dimensions has been confirmed by someone with measuring equipment. and underneath that, or possibly alongside it, something that ran hotter and didn't have a clean name. He thought, if 12 of those bindings hadn't been there, what would the last 10 years have looked like? He did not say that out loud. He thanked Bill, which was the thing you said, and went back to herbology, and repotted the rest of the mandrakes with precision, and thought about it. The special session of the Wizengamot convened in November, with the particular energy of an institution being forced to look at something it would have preferred to examine from a distance over a period of years in committee. Dumbledore presided as chief warlock. Around him, 50 members in plum-coloured robes embroidered with silver sat in the tiered seating and listened to Goblin representatives present findings that the session had been convened to address. A pattern of suppressive magical bindings on wizarding children, with 2 documented cases, one with 61 bindings, one with 12, and a methodology consistent across both examinations. Fudge found him in the corridor beforehand. The Minister for Magic had, in Dumbledore's extensive experience of him, 2 modes. The mode where things were going acceptably, and his lime-green bowler hat was at a jaunty angle, and the mode where things were not going acceptably, and his lime-green bowler hat was at a slightly less jaunty angle. It was currently the second mode. He wanted Dumbledore to call the examination instruments unreliable. He wanted the Goblin evidence characterized as self-serving, a nation with outstanding grievances presenting convenient findings to a body it was pressuring. He wanted the 2 cases treated as outliers rather than a pattern, the connection between them questioned, the conclusions deferred to further study. Dumbledore said he understood the minister's concerns. Fudge said that wasn't what he'd asked. Dumbledore said he had always found, in cases of genuine institutional concern, that the most durable response was one that addressed the underlying reality rather than the political expression of it. He said he was confident the Wizengamot would weigh the evidence carefully. He said all of this with the measured neutrality of a man who had learned, across more years than Fudge had been alive, that the difference between a truthful statement and a useful one was more complicated than it appeared. He went in and presided over the session, and said nothing that was a lie. He also said nothing that was fully the truth. He had been maintaining this distinction for 10 years, and he was aware, in a way he had not been in August, that it was becoming harder to hold. After the session, Harry and Neville sat in a corridor at Hogwarts that neither of them had specifically chosen. It was just the first one they'd both ended up in, on the way back from the library, separately, and had stopped walking at the same time. They did not know each other well. They were both 11, which meant that the common ground between them, a tower dormitory, a transfiguration class, the ongoing social project of their first term, was technically extensive and practically thin. They had been in the same room for most of September, without yet arriving at the particular moment that converted proximity into something else. Neville told Harry about the 12 bindings in the careful, underweight way he told most things, stating the facts without putting pressure on them, as if he had learned that the things he said occupied more space than he meant them to, and he was still calibrating how much to let in. Harry said he was sorry. Neville was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure sorry is the right word. What would be the right word? Neville thought about it, with the concentration he brought to problems he actually wanted to solve. Maybe, he said slowly. Now we know. Harry considered this. It was the most useful thing anyone had said to him about any of it since August. Not a comfort. Not an apology. Not a management of the situation into something easier to hold. Just the acknowledgement that knowledge was the thing, that before was before and after was after, and the difference was what you could see. Yeah, Harry said. Now we know. The portrait at the end of the corridor stirred briefly, made a sound of agreement or possibly indigestion, and went back to sleep. The hospital wing in June had become something else. Not a hospital room, but a working space. The Goblin preparation team had been arriving in stages since April. By June, their instruments were arranged on stands around the middle bed with the precision of people who had been preparing this for 8 months and did not intend to do it twice. High windows let in evening light at a low angle across the stone floor. Harry sat on the bed with the consent forms in his lap. Actual parchment, actual ink, 3 witnesses, Bill Weasley on his left, who had found this in the first place, and who had a look on his face that meant he was being very calm on purpose. Dumbledore across from him, very still. A Goblin authority at the foot of the bed whose name Harry had been told and had committed to memory because it seemed important. Harry had signed his own name on each page. He had read the forms carefully. He was 11 years old, and he had read every word. Snape was at the door. He was standing with his arms folded and his black robes in their usual stillness, and the expression of a man at a vigil who had decided not to call it that. He had been there when Harry arrived. He would, Harry sensed, be there when Harry left. Harry lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling. He thought about binding too, the love magic, the ancient working of sacrifice, the one not being touched tonight. The classification 8 months ago had been clear. Not suppressive, not a candidate for extraction. Whatever happened, that stayed. His mother's last act was not a binding so much as something that had chosen to live in him. He thought, those 2 things can both be true. He closed his eyes and let the goblins work. The instruments were nothing like the tools that had examined him in August. These were active, worked silver, catching the air at a frequency just below hearing. Shaped sound, Bill had tried to explain. The closest human vocabulary came to what it was. The goblins moved with the efficiency of a team that had rehearsed this and had no interest in ceremony. It was not painless. It was not violence, exactly. It was something with more precision than violence, the way Bill would later describe it to Ron, searching for words he only partly had. Like watching someone carefully unseal a thing that was never meant to be sealed. The scar had been there since 1981. The fragment had been fused to it since 1981. Harry had no memory of a time before the burning, because the burning had always been background, and the background was what you called normal when you had nothing to compare it to. His scar burned white. He did not cry out. This surprised everyone in the room except Harry, who had 10 years of practice at the management of pain as a private matter, and who understood that the noise was his to keep or release, and had been making that decision on behalf of no one but himself for as long as he could remember. He lay still. The goblin instruments rose. Snape felt it before he heard it. The castle had a quality Snape had spent 10 years learning, a baseline against which disturbances registered at the edge of awareness before they registered consciously. He had been monitoring it all year. Quirrell's stuttering, the wrongness behind his eyes, the thing at the back of his head, the counter-jinxes performed during Quidditch that he had not felt the need to explain. Now the baseline shifted. He stepped out of the hospital wing into the corridor and found Bill at the door. "Quirrell is moving," Snape said. "Stay with Harry." Bill looked at him. "And you?" Snape had already gone. The trapdoor on the 3rd floor, Fluffy unconscious, the harp still playing by a charm wound, and left, Quirrell's work, and sloppy, and suggesting urgency. The devil's snare, which Snape moved through on Sprout's logic, the flying keys, the chessboard, both navigated by a man who had helped design the system and knew what the designers had assumed. The potion chamber, he had designed himself. He crossed it in 15 seconds. The final chamber was lit by an indirect blue light that had no visible source. The mirror of Erist stood at the far end of the room, and Quirrell stood before it, and the thing at the back of Quirrell's head was audible now in the way it had never been audible upstairs. A voice that did not belong in a human throat, straining at the surface. Quirrell's hands were at the mirror's frame. He had been at this for some time, Snape judged, from the quality of his stillness. The stillness of someone who had tried everything and was deciding to try the same things again. The stone was not coming out. The mirror would give it only to someone who wished to find it without using it, and Voldemort in any host could not approach that condition. "He's not here," Snape said. Quirrell turned. The duel was brief and very cold. Quirrell was not a duelist. The abilities sustaining him were Voldemort's, diminished in a damaged host. And Snape had spent a year preparing for exactly this. When it ended, Quirrell was on the floor, and the voice behind his eyes had gone to the kind of silence that comes before decisions. Voldemort abandoned the dying host. Snape felt it pass through the room. The wraith was not here, and then it was not here in a different way. Not absent, but fled, north and cold and diminished. Quirrell died. The body lay in the blue light, and the mirror stood unmoved, and the stone was still inside it, and would remain there until someone with no desire to use it came to look. In the hospital wing, the instruments reached a pitch that was felt in the sternum rather than heard in the ears. Then silence. Harry screamed once. It was a single short sound, involuntary, the sound of a thing releasing rather than a thing breaking. The sound, Bill would think later, of a door opening. Then it stopped. Bill was at the bedside before the goblins had their documentation in order. Harry was staring at the ceiling with his hands flat at his sides, and an expression Bill had not seen on him before. Not shock, not relief. Something more careful than either. The expression of a person listening to the absence of a sound that had been there so long it had become ambient, that had been present in every room and every silence for 11 years, and had stopped. "It's out?" Harry asked. "It's out," Bill said. Harry closed his eyes. Dumbledore came through the castle gates at midnight, which was later than he had intended and earlier than it might have been. The information that something had happened had reached him in the way information in motion reached him, by the particular quality of the air, and by a Phoenix Patronus that had taken his message to McGonagall 3 hours ago and not returned with reassurance. He found Snape at the entrance to the lower chambers, slightly singed, standing at the doorway to the final corridor, with the bearing of a man who had finished something and was not yet ready to move on from where it had finished, Snape told him. Dumbledore went down to the final chamber and stood in the blue light for a moment. The mirror of Erist showed him what it had always shown him, which he did not look at for long. He reached in and retrieved the Philosopher's Stone. It was warm in his palm, which he had always found strange, that it held heat. He held it for a moment, with nobody watching his face. Then he put it away and went upstairs. Harry was asleep. Bill was in the chair beside the bed that people sat in during vigils, not looking like he was going to leave. The room had the particular quiet of a space where something irreversible had happened, and everyone present was still deciding how to hold it. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long time. "Is everything all right?" Bill asked, the same question he'd asked about everything since August, with the same quality of someone who intended to know the answer, whether it was the answer they wanted or not. "One thing was lost tonight," Dumbledore said, "and one thing was gained. And both of those things are true, and I'm not yet certain which direction the accounting runs." Bill looked at him steadily. That sounds like what adults say when they want to avoid answering. Perhaps, Dumbledore said. He pulled the chair on the other side of the bed and sat in it, and did not leave either. Harry slept. He did not dream about a locked door with green light burning under it. He had dreamed about that door, or about versions of it, for as long as he had been old enough to remember his dreams. Tonight there was only the dark behind his eyes, which was quiet, and through the hospital wing windows a sky beginning to go pale at the eastern edge. He did not know what he was, now that he was not the sum of the things that had been done to him. He supposed he would find out. On the second morning in the hospital wing, Harry touched his scar. He did it the way he had always done it, carefully, half expecting the burn that had lived there for as long as he had a memory of his own body. What he found was the old ridge of tissue, nothing more. He pressed 2 fingers against it and felt the shape of the wound, and nothing beneath it. No link, no flare at the back of his skull when the wrong thought crossed his mind. No faint pressure behind his eyes that had been there since he was old enough to have eyes capable of pressure. The pressure was gone. He lay back and tried to name the absence. He didn't have a word for it yet. He decided, provisionally, to call it quiet. Ron came on the second afternoon, and Hermione came with him, which Harry had been noticing as an increasingly regular arrangement. Ron brought sweets, a bag of Bertie Bott's every flavour beans, with the pragmatic generosity of someone who had grown up sharing from a large supply, and considered giving portions a form of communication. Hermione brought a slim green book with gilt lettering that said, on its spine, a concise history of goblin-wizard relations. She set it on the nightstand, in a way that was not, she said, suggesting Harry read it now. She had bookmarked 3 pages. Harry looked at both of them. Ron sorting the beans by colour with the focus he brought to chess, Hermione already reading the book she had supposedly brought for Harry, and felt something he didn't have a name for either. He decided this name could also wait. The sweets are mostly terrible, Ron said, putting a maroon one back. That's the fun, though. That's the point. No, it isn't, Harry said, and ate one that tasted of toast, and then another that tasted of something he chose not to identify, and felt, for the first time in a long time, like he was exactly the age he was supposed to be. Dumbledore came on the 3rd day. He sat in the visitor's chair with his half-moon spectacles, and his long silver beard, and the manner of a man who had decided, between the corridor and the bedside, to be a reporter of facts rather than a manager of them. Harry found he appreciated the decision. The Goblin nation, Dumbledore said, would re-enter treaty negotiations with Britain. The 1752 Goblin Accords were formally voided and would be replaced with a new instrument, currently being drafted by a joint committee. Senior Gringotts staff who conducted magical examinations would be permitted to carry wands for those purposes, a limited and documented modification of the wand ban of 1631. Not universal wand rights, not a concession of broad equality, but an acknowledgement that the blanket application of the ban had never been defensible and was not going to continue unchallenged. Gringotts retained full autonomy over its own operations, as had always been the arrangement in practice, and was now the arrangement in writing. Harry's remaining institutional bindings, the cluster that Bill's work had not yet reached, the ministry registrations and stamps that had accumulated over a decade, would be cleared by ministry decree. A political concession. The ministry had preferred a quiet resolution to the alternative, which was a full Wizengamot investigation into systemic binding of minors across Wizarding Britain, and had made the calculation accordingly. Harry asked what Dumbledore thought of all of this. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. He said, he thought the goblins had been right to be angry. He said being right does not always mean one has been wise, and that on reflection he was not certain he had always been wise. He said this with the precise weight of a man choosing each word for what it would and would not carry. It was, Harry recognized, as close to an apology as Dumbledore's sentences were currently built to deliver. "Thank you," Harry said, which was the response that seemed most true. Dumbledore left. He wrote the letter to Petunia Dursley that evening in his office. He wrote it in the factual register he used when the facts were sufficient, and he did not trust himself to be anything other than factual. Harry would not be returning to Privet Drive this summer. He would not be returning the summer after, or the ones that followed. The blood ward that had tied Harry to the house on her street had run its course. The degradation had begun when Harry extended his absence, and the Goblin examination had accelerated what was already coming. The house was still the house. The arrangement was done. He wrote, and then removed the sentence. Lily would have understood. He sat for a while with the space where the sentence had been. He folded the letter without replacing it, because he did not know whether the sentence was true, and he had long since learned that claiming for Lily the understanding he needed to believe she had was a form of using her that she could no longer refuse. He had placed the blood ward in her name, and because of her blood, and the choice had been his, and what she would have understood or not was her own business, and not his to invoke. He sealed the letter. He did not feel better. He sent it anyway. Bill said his goodbyes in the entrance hall on the last day of June. His Egypt rotation had been waiting since August. His London work was documented. The extraction complete, the treaty obligations clear, his Gringotts file formally closed. He came down the main staircase, with his trunk shrunk in his pocket, and his document wallet, and the same dragon-hide boots, and he found Harry and Ron in the entrance hall, which is where Harry and Ron were most mornings, when there was nothing requiring them to be elsewhere. "The goblins found 61 things that were wrong," Bill said to Harry. "There's 61 things that aren't wrong anymore." "Some of them are still there," Harry said. "The trace. The ones we didn't get to." "Yes," Bill said. "Some of them are still there." He held Harry's gaze for a moment. "That's what next year is for, and the year after." He ruffled Harry's hair, which was already at maximum disorder, and did not benefit from the addition. Harry immediately tried to fix it, which was not possible. Bill grinned and turned to Ron, and did something to Ron's hair that made Ron say something that wasn't a word. And then he was gone, through the doors and out into the June light and toward the apparition point on the grounds. Ron watched him go. He had the expression of someone who was proud in a way they didn't quite know what to do with yet, and who had decided the solution was to stand quietly and wait for the feeling to find its own shape. Snape came to the potions classroom on the last evening of term. Harry was already there, not waiting for Snape, just waiting in the particular way he had learned to wait in rooms over the past year, the way of someone who had stopped filling silences with apology. The classroom was empty and cool, the cauldrons cold on their brackets, the smell of old ingredients and stone, the same smell it had been in September. Snape worked without speaking. The process was not long. A single cluster of low-impact registration charms, the last of the institutional bindings the ministry decree had cleared, but not yet formally removed, and Snape had been asked to perform the mechanics of it, because it was his specialty, and not for any reason that required warmth. When it was finished, he set his wand on the table and said nothing. Harry said, "Thank you." Snape looked at him. The look lasted longer than looks usually did when Snape was conducting them. In it, Harry had the sense of being seen as something complicated and specific. Not James Potter's son, or the boy who lived, or a problem that had arrived at the school and generated paperwork, but something that did not yet have a category and was going to require one eventually. "Try not to waste it," Snape said. He left. His robes settled behind him in the doorway, and then the room was still. Harry sat for a moment. Then he raised a borrowed wand. He had not yet found his own. That was Ollivander's in September, and said, "Lumos." The light that came out was nothing like a first year's Lumos. It filled the room. It reached the far wall, and the cold cauldrons, and the high ceiling, and the brackets, and it was steady, and it was his, and it had apparently been waiting to be this size for 11 years. He sat in it for a while, just to know what it felt like. The world outside the potions classroom had not resolved. 5 Horcruxes existed in it somewhere: a diary, a ring, a locket, a cup, a diadem, and a wraith in Albania that had fled a dying host and was not finished. The prophecy stood. The things that would have to happen had not yet happened. Harry understood all of this with the specific clarity of someone who has stopped pretending, that knowing what's coming and knowing how to meet it are the same thing. He was 11 years old and new to nearly everything,